Black perspectives haven't always been centered in the telling of America's story. Now, we're taking center stage. Introducing NPR's Black Stories, Black Truths, a collection of Black-led stories from NPR's podcasts. Search NPR Black Stories, Black Truths wherever you get your podcasts.
Support comes from Mercedes-Benz of Buckhead, where the power of electric meets the power of Mercedes. Introducing a lineup of electric vehicles, the EQB, the EQS sedan and SUV, the EQE sedan and SUV. The vehicles are all electric. The feeling is all Mercedes. Mercedesofbuckhead.com.
Welcome back to another edition of Political Breakfast. The weeks come and go so quickly, and before you know it, it is our time to tape again. So it's good to see both of you. Our strategists are here, Brian Robinson and Tharon Johnson, as well as our producer, Lily Oppenheimer. I'm your host, Lisa Ram, and I appreciate you, the listener. We're always glad to have you aboard and listen to what everyone has to say regarding all things Georgia politics and sometimes national politics, too. Good day to both of you. And I don't know, it depends on what team you were rooting for. Yesterday may or may not have been a good day for football. Tharon, I'll begin with you because you have that look.
I mean, it was a tough Sunday for me. I actually watched one game on the plane. So shout out to Delta to making sure that I actually got a plane that actually had the television and it was working. But look, two great games. I really kind of wanted Lamar Jackson to go to the Super Bowl. He's worked so hard, renegotiated a major contract, but 15 is just unmatched. I mean, anytime that guy's on the field, he's hard to beat. Patrick Mahomes. And then on the NFC side, my dear friend who I was with is a Detroit Lions fan. I mean, he's been so loyal to this team for so long, and I really kind of wanted to see them go to the Super Bowl. But shout out to San Francisco, who played a great game. And then lastly, thank you, Arthur Blank, Rich McKay, the general manager as well, for not hiring Bill Belichick. I think Raheem Morris is definitely the right pick. So let's go Falcons.
I'm excited to see what Raheem Morris does for us too. He's obviously got a great defense going out there for the Rams. So, and he's got some Atlanta connections, filled in for after a coach got fired a few years back as the temporary head coach in Atlanta. So, hey, hope springs eternal. As far as the Super Bowl goes, I always judge these things if they're not my team, if they're not the Falcons, by which Georgia Bulldogs are on the team. Of course, the Ravens have Roquan Smith, one of the greatest ever. I really wanted him to get in there and get a ring. But this way, you've got McCole Hardman from Elberton on the Chiefs, and you've got Charlie Werner from deep northeast Georgia playing for the 49ers. So that is how I judge these things. I think UGA has the longest streak of consecutive Super Bowls with a former player playing on the field. So that's pretty cool.
Yeah, it was a nice day for football, just depending on who your team was. And then, I don't know, Brian, politics managed to get woven into that as well with our President Joe Biden.
Yeah, well, we're going to be talking about this a little bit later, but I saw my first presidential campaign ad of the cycle. It was a Joe Biden campaign ad. It was not a super PAC, it was not a third party group. And it was an issue that Tharon was bringing up last week and that state Democrats brought up at a news conference last week. A white woman from Texas, talking about not being able to get access to an abortion, saying that she was a mother of numerous children, really wanted this one, but this one was had a fatal condition that wouldn't allow it to live outside of the womb.
In Texas, you are forced to carry that pregnancy, and that is because of Donald Trump overturning Roe v. Wade. The choice was completely taken away. I was to continue my pregnancy, putting my life at risk.
And it was of note to me because, as I've said here before, Democrats have talked about the abortion issue being a decisive one for them, one that's a winner for them. And I, pushed back a little bit saying, well, then why did no one lose after the heartbeat law took effect in Georgia? Why did Stacey Abrams not make that a part of her campaign in 2022 if it was such a mover of numbers? And, obviously Joe Biden's team thinks that this does move numbers, particularly in some of these swing states like Georgia. I don't know. We haven't seen a lot of data. We did see abortion play a role in some of the far north states, Wisconsin, Minnesota. You saw it used there to effect by Democrats, but we haven't seen it here. So this is an experiment. We can kind of see what the empirical data is going to show us about how this moves numbers in Georgia. So I'll be watching. It was a well done ad. I mean, the woman was very persuasive, somebody empathetic. So, we'll see.
Tharon, did you happen to see that ad on your flight?
I did, actually. And I think I saw that. That was the second game, right? Or was it the first game?
I can't remember. I kind of tuned out of the first one because it seemed to be getting out of hand. So I can't remember which one it was.
I definitely think, So Lisa, that one I actually caught at home. I think it was the Lions and 49ers game. No, look, I mean, to Brian's point, the woman, Lisa, you got to see this ad. I mean, one thing about the Biden-Harris media team is first rate. And she's direct to camera, and her cadence and when she was talking, it kind of it brings you in. You don't even realize it's a Biden-Harris campaign message until sort of maybe 3/4 through the way. And so, look, I'm not going to sit up here and act like I'm a genius, but I do know a little bit what I talk about when it comes to national politics. Remember, I shared with our listeners, Lisa, on this podcast, we got the direct marching orders from BO, told us to go back to our states. Sense of urgency came later on the Washington Post, to make sure that we're all on board. I got the message very clearly that the assault by Republicans on reproductive health, particularly with women, was going to be a huge driving force. And so what you're seeing now is that the Biden campaign is using this significant leverage that they have to have the incumbent president. While Trump is fighting still over in the Republican primary, they can start advertising in states like Georgia. And then lastly, Lisa, I have to kind of, as Cat Williams said, don't let people rewrite history. I do want to go on the record for myself. And shout out to Cat Williams, but he's just that Shay Shay podcast.
Cat Williams.
Yeah, regular swag to the show. But it's Cat Williams talking about, right? Not letting people rewrite history. I called it out 2 weeks ago. I said that if the Biden-Harris campaign didn't hire someone very, very soon in Georgia, start spending money here, I was going to start to get worried. Well, 2 weeks ago, and I missed this last week, but the campaign hired a veteran strategist, Jonae Wartell, a woman from Atlanta, from Georgia, has worked on a lot of different campaigns, most recently worked on the sort of independent side of the DSCC and others for the Warnock reelection. And so they have a veteran strategist. They're gonna ramp up the staffing here. They already made a sizable buy on television. They're advertising on playoff games. And let's not forget, they made a historic buy around the country, particularly on Black and Latino radio stations. And so I think it's go time. And I think that ad was aimed at a lot of different people, but specifically those independent, disaffected Republican white women and women in general, and some men who can really relate to that very touching story that the woman shared on the campaign ad.
Playing off what Tharon is saying, he talks about men. One of the strongest pro-choice demographics actually is Gen Z men, which if you think about it, makes a lot of sense. I mean, they're the ones who might run into this issue much more likely than somebody like me in Generation X these days. But the demographic that they are targeting here was they were using a woman who is a professional, and she is white, and she is definitely speaking to those suburban metropolitan voters, women and men, in some of these swing states. One question that I have, two questions actually. One, I can see their strategy in Georgia where we have the heartbeat law, a pro-life law in effect. I don't know what the laws are in Nevada and Arizona and Pennsylvania, some of the other swing states. But I do wonder, on a broad scale, how effective as a motivator this issue will be in states that are blue that have pro-choice laws on the books in response to the Supreme Court ruling a few years ago. For women and men who don't see this as an issue facing them immediately, how much of a mover is it? That's why I wonder, is this ad just playing in a state like Georgia? And is this sort of going to be targeted here? That would make more sense to me than going broad with this message. My second question is, let's look at how Donald Trump has just talked about this issue. He has actually attacked states that have, and governors who have signed heartbeat laws. He's had some negative things to say about it, says it's bad politics. But the ad that came out on Sunday didn't talk about heartbeat laws. It talked about him putting on the Supreme Court justices nominating those who made this decision, who gave the pro-life forces a majority on the court. So that's the direction that the Biden's team is going after, because on the other side, Donald Trump is saying, look, I'm not for these most restrictive laws that have been passed on the state level. And, so I really wonder, do Republican voters, those who are particularly motivated by pro-life messaging and they really feel strongly about protecting the unborn, how are they going to respond to how Trump is positioning himself when they've been such strong supporters of his because he did create the pro-life majority on the court? This is going to be one of those really interesting issues where there's some give and take on both sides.
Let's get there in it quickly. What's percolating with the Biden campaign with this? You got Biden, he began stumping in South Carolina, and there's all this abortion talk starting to percolate again. What are you hearing behind the scenes, and how might he navigate this, in the presidential cycle?
B-Rob brings up some really important questions. And, the thing that I think that really sets this podcast is that we're both two strategists that have actually been in the throes of the campaign. And so, Brian, I'll do my best to answer that question, and also, Lisa, answer your question about, South Carolina and what's sort of the tone of the campaign now. So if you really look at this ad, it was also about what the Biden campaign has been talking a lot about. And you see that particularly the president is shifting back to this message around the soul of the nation is on the ballot, right? It's about, saving democracy, the soul of the nation. And so what it did with this ad, while it did not give Donald Trump free press, and, he's going to have to explain how he's evolved on abortion rights and pro-choice issues, right? He's going to have to explain that. They're not going to pay for ads that lets him sort of tee him up. But what they are going to do is remind voters that because of his Supreme Court justice appointments, it's a reason why Roe v. Wade was overturned. And this woman, white woman, to me, crystallized and really drove home that message. Fast forward to what you're seeing in South Carolina is a lot what you're going to see in Georgia. The president was in South Carolina because there's an upcoming primary vote this weekend in South Carolina. I think it's February 3rd. And, he's going to win that state. And why is South Carolina so important, Lisa? You've heard us talk about this. When the history books are written in the history of this election in 2020, we all know that South Carolina was the pivotal turn in the Joe Biden campaign. When he won South Carolina with the help of Congressman Jim Clyburn, who pretty much went all out to make sure he won, he's back to those roots. And then, that there's this sort of ripple effect, this carryover from South Carolina to Georgia, because even that coast, Augusta, Savannah area, particularly Augusta, they actually share the media market with South Carolina. And so he was very, very specific about black businesses. He toured some female-owned black businesses. Of course, he went to a black church, talked a lot about manufacturing jobs, talked a lot about what he's done. And it's also getting ahead of the upcoming primary on the Republican side. And so I'm much more encouraged, Lisa, much more inspired by the messaging. Now, the one thing I will warn, and this is something that I got to be honest about what pundits are saying, is we saw the Stacey Abrams campaign was very similar. When she came out in 2018, it was a direct appeal to moderate voters, independent voters, particularly white women. Biden campaign, I'm sure, has looked at how that campaign was effective and how it was not effective. So while you come out and you're targeting a broad demographic, to answer your question, Brian, I think the next ad you will see would be much more Georgia specific. It'll be much more Georgia specific, moving black women, younger voters, showing a tremendous respect to our women and men in the labor movement. And I think you'll see the next ad really focus on Georgia specific things that the president has delivered. I think that this first ad is more so targeted in states like Georgia, where they believe that this issue around protecting reproductive rights for citizens, particularly women, and just the stuff, we got to point this out. It was the woman talking about she was forced to make a decision in that state because of that law. And had that law not been in place, she was so afraid about her health and whether or not she was going to die by having to conceive and move forward with this child. And so I think it's probably a nationwide ad, but I think going forward, you'll see more Georgia specific messaging.
Yeah, more fine tuning from both candidates. Brian, you think?
Yeah, and it's like I said, I don't think it should be a broad message. If I was a Democrat, which I'm not, but I just don't think it's going to be a huge motivator in states that don't have pro-life laws on the books. And we're one that, one, does, and two, we're a swing state. So we are an obvious place to do that. And Tharon just mentioned, Biden's got a primary coming up in South Carolina in a few weeks. This is the first time he's really been on the ballot because the Iowa and New Hampshire were taken off of the Democratic schedule. So this is momentous that's going on across the border. And this ad wasn't running in the Augusta market or the Savannah market that goes into both states. It was in Atlanta, one of the most expensive media markets in the country. This marks a true beginning of a national general election campaign starting here in one of the swing states. I would imagine that if it's on here, the Dems are or will soon have stuff up in Philly, Milwaukee, Phoenix, Las Vegas, because those are places they're going to have to move some numbers pretty quick.
Sounds Like ATL is a music documentary series that takes an in-depth look at the artists amplifying Atlanta's famed music community. Built around a desire to highlight Atlanta's diverse and world-renowned music scene, each episode features unforgettable, intimate musical performances by fresh new musical guests, each with exclusive interviews about the stories behind their music. Listen at wabe.org or wherever you find your podcasts.
Ever wondered where to find the best dumplings in town? Curious about Atlanta's obsession with lemon pepper? Join us on Savory Stories, a new podcast as we uncover the untold tales behind Atlanta's culinary scene. From the roots of your favorite dishes to the creators that bring them to life, we're diving deep into the heart of the city's food culture. Listen to Savory Stories at wabe.org/podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts.
WABE.
Can we talk Governor Brian Kemp for a moment? It seems like he's on the national stage again. It was reported over the weekend he's one of dozens of GOP leaders backing Texas Governor Greg Abbott's controversial southern border policies. He was on Fox and Friends over the weekend saying Georgia needs to stand by the Lone Star State. And in case you missed it, here's what he said.
Listen, it's like, governors all over the country have been saying every state's a border state now. That includes Georgia, and that's why we're standing strong with Governor Abbott to stop this insanity at the southern border because the president and the White House won't.
I'll yield some time to Brian because I think he'll, sort of basically give more of the Republican sort of strategy behind this. But Lisa, it's no secret. And Brian, I know this. We both do national media. The number one issue for Republican primary voters right now is securing the border. And so what I think the governor is doing is two things. One, as Brian has reminded us, he's the vice chair of the Republican Governors Association. So he's kind of already in sort of a national role and would be in a more national role. But then two, to be fair to the governor, Lisa, this is something that he's sort of been talking about. But you're right. I mean, to go on Fox and Friends during the legislative session, after he's went on a international trip, continuing to put himself in a national spotlight, one has to speculate that the governor is continuing to position himself for a possible U.S. Senate run in 2026, or maybe a possible national VP or a presidential run in 2028. And so this is something that he's been very passionate about, and he supported the governor of Texas historically, on not just on this issue, but other issues as well.
Absolutely a issue of great import to Republican voters, and something that is a motivator for them, something that gets them to the polls, and something that makes them really angry about this Democratic administration's policies. Really watching how this negotiation goes in Washington and how Americans are going to respond, how Republicans and independents and Democrats are going to respond to Joe Biden saying, Mitch McConnell and I agree on this idea, and Donald Trump saying, don't pass anything, blame it on me. Blame it on me. That's his quote that was in the news over the weekend. I think that that's the wrong way to go, because I believe Donald Trump, if Biden came to the table and we did something that was serious to shut down the border, I think Trump could legitimately say, I changed the argument in this country on this issue. I stood up to all the elites who said that talking about border security was racist. I changed the way Americans approach this. And this is us making some steps toward what I promised people going back to 2015 when I first ran for president. That's what I think that we should do. As a Republican who is very concerned about the border, I want it fixed. And I don't really care who does it. I just want it fixed. And I'm really worried that if Biden does get reelected, that he will have no incentive to do anything on the border. I don't think in his heart of hearts that he really wants to. That's just my opinion. You can disagree. But I just think that with the political shackles taken off of him, I think he is doing this kind of against his will because the politics of it are so strong. I don't think he's going to be willing to do that in January of 2025. So I hope that we can seize on this now. For Kemp, I think he is avoiding brilliantly what has happened to so many elected Republicans who have stood up to Trump. So many of them begin to be seen as moderates and outside of the Republican mainstream. Think about former Senators Jeff Flake or Bob Corker, John McCain, Mitt Romney, who's still in the Senate. People have been sidelined and marginalized because they have not been fans of Trump and have said so publicly. What Kemp is doing with stuff like this, with issues like this, is reminding American voters beyond Georgia's electorate that he is a staunch conservative and he is with you on the issues that matter to you. And he's willing to go and ruffle some feathers because it's one thing to do for securing the border. It is a hard-edged approach, a more hard-edged approach to say, I support Governor Abbott in standing up to the Biden administration and creating my own border barrier. It's good politics for Kemp. I do hope that we can do something that maintains the rule of law. We've got to be respectful of a Supreme Court decision. But politically, before Biden came out for this deal, all we had ever seen Biden do was fight Abbott on the border, fighting him for trying to stop the flow of migrants. I saw that headline last week when the Supreme Court decision came down, and I'm like, why in the world is Biden making this the only thing we ever hear him say about immigration? And then shortly thereafter, we see him willing to come to the table. Huge pressing issue. And I usually have a good sense of how these things are going to play out. I don't know how Trump's gambit, as far as saying don't do anything, is going to work with the electorate because people do want to see it stopped. It's not just a political issue for Americans.
You know, Brian is right. We do have a Supreme Court decision and we have to respect. But to sort of infer or say that the president of the United States of America don't really care about securing the border, that's just blatantly false. What they can do a better job of is talking about the achievements and some of the strides that they made to secure the border safely and with a level of humanity. I have said this publicly, and I'll say this again to all my Democrats who want to win this race in 2024. We've got to figure out a way to push back on the rhetoric that Republicans are talking about as far as the president and the vice president don't care about the border, have not done anything. This president coming out and supporting this deal, looking at strategic ways to have a long-term solution to secure the border is the right thing to do. And I predict that you're going to hear this administration during the campaign move a little bit more to a conservative approach without adopting the radical rights sort of response. And as we just heard, Donald Trump is saying, don't do anything. That's not an option. And I agree with Brian on that. But you're going to see them probably come out with a little bit more of a conservative messaging around the border, not to win over all the Republicans. They're not going to be able to give every single Republican who is very upset about the border crisis what they want, but just enough to show leadership, to show that there is a plan in place, and to make sure that we deal with it. So I'm here to tell you, it is an issue not just for Republicans. It's an issue for all Americans that we got to figure out how to deal with it. And what we've seen since the pandemic, Lisa, you know, we always talk about how the pandemic affected the U.S., right, the nation. A lot of us don't talk about how the pandemic affected us in the world and how, you know, COVID was not just a U.S. problem. It was a world problem. And a lot of these border states are experiencing people, human beings, trying to, you know, get over into this country for whatever reason. But we got to figure out a way to communicate to the public that there is a plan in place, there's a way to do it, and that Biden and the vice president are leading the effort.
Yeah, very, very fluid issue here that we'll hear many more conversations about. Before we get out of here today, I want to talk about maybe you would call this good politics. I think both Republicans and Democrats are applauding this. And Brian, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but Mayor Dickens signed that executive order. I think it was worth almost $5 million to eradicate what he's calling long-term homelessness here in Atlanta. So a lot of people are applauding the move. Brian, let's begin with you. What are Republicans saying about it?
I don't think Republicans are talking about this issue just yet. I do think, though, that it is smart politically for Andre Dickens. Of course, this is an issue that's humanitarian. It goes beyond just politics. But we've seen how this becomes a political issue, particularly when you look at California, where the homelessness epidemic, the drug use, the needles left on the ground, the human feces on sidewalks and in public spaces. That is where you begin to see the middle and even some Democrats begin to rebel against local policies that have failed to address it. So, I think Republicans have been willing to work with Andre Dickens on a range of issues because they've seen him as a good partner. They've seen him as pragmatic and sensible and have worked together with him collaboratively, for example, on the Public Safety Training Center. I think this is something that is going to require a lot of long-term strategies. It's not just about building houses and putting a roof over the homeless population. It has to do with providing drug recovery resources, mental health resources, job training abilities once they get back on their feet. There's a lot to this, and I don't know all the details of what the mayor is doing, but it's an issue where I think we do have a common desire to work together because no one, whether it's because you are empathetic with those who are stranded on the street, or whether it's because you are scared of the people on the streets, or you think that it hurts economic development in your community, regardless of your motive, I think we all want to see this get fixed. And let me wrap up by saying, as a quick pushback on what Tharon said, I hear him on immigration. He's right that Democrats need to pivot a little bit. I just think it may be too late politically unless Republicans give them a gift and an opening. And I'll end it with that.
Lisa, thank you so much for making time for what I believe, is up there on the list of priorities when it comes to public safety in this city and also dealing with affordable housing. But let me just say that this is an issue that Republicans and Democrats and every citizen of Georgia should get behind in dealing with this issue around homelessness. And so you definitely got to start with the mayor. I mean, he deserves a lot of credit, but also there's a couple other people I want to mention in his administration. Courtney English, who's his senior advisor, and Josh Humphreys. These are two young men who have been working shoulder to shoulder with the mayor. Again, the mayor deserves all the credit because he's the leader of the city. But also I want to applaud the business community. And B-Rob, you know this. The one group of people in the state of Georgia, particularly in the metro area, that has been begging for more leadership. Not saying there hasn't been leadership because our former mayors have dealt with this issue too. Mayor Franklin had played a key role, Mayor Reed, and also Mayor Bottoms. But Mayor Dickens, what he's doing with this new development within the city of Atlanta, and they're calling it the Melody. And the reason they're calling it the Melody is because it's named after a woman named Melody Bloodworth. I want to say her name on this podcast. And this is a woman who's been leading a very, very long time and dealing with the issue around homelessness. And to Brian, to let our listeners know exactly what's on the table here, is that they've created 40 micro unit shipping containers. And the goal is to offer privacy, independence, and a sense of community to our homeless people. And we got to remember that they're people. Chris Womack reminded me recently, last week, Lisa, he's a dear friend and leader of Southern Company, but he's also the chair of the Metro Chamber Atlanta board. He said that, guys, when you see homeless people on the streets of Atlanta, don't just roll your window up. Don't just turn your head. And don't just say, you know what, I'm not going to give them any money because I know that's what they want. You need to stop and acknowledge them at least with a hey or a goodbye and treat them as people. And so the goal with the city of Atlanta, Lisa, is to create 500 units of rapid housing of public land by 2025. And so the business community, along with the civic community, and now the mayor with his leadership and these two individuals I mentioned and a host of other partners, naming this the Melody. The event that they had, Lisa, it was heartwarming. Councilman Jason Winston actually led the effort with the legislation. The mayor signed the executive order, and you just had the city coming together to deal with a huge, huge humanitarian problem that we're facing in the city. And I just want to applaud the mayor for coming up with innovative ways to make sure that our brothers and sisters in the homeless community have the proper housing that they have. I mean, just think about this. When we had these freezing temperatures just a few weeks ago, we had all this rain. You saw the mayor out there doing a body count, counting the homeless people in the city. And he came back the next week along with public safety officials and others to provide them the proper short-term and long-term housing solutions that they deserve.
Yeah. Homelessness, I think, is up 30% year to year. So he called it his way of embracing, those in need. So, yeah, it was quite the sight. We're going to end on that happy note. We'll do it again soon, guys. Tharon Johnson, Brian Robinson, Lily Oppenheimer, let's all have a good week.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you, guys.